In the winter of 1847, something came to the mountain town of Millbrook, Vermont, something that looked like a man, spoke like a man, but was not a man at all. For those who survived, the memory never faded. They called him Samuel Hawthorne. But there is no record of him anywhere before that terrible February night. No church records, no census, nothing. It was as if he stepped straight out of the snow itself. And the more the townspeople learned about him, the more they wished they hadn't. Millbrook in 1847 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Tucked deep between the Green Mountains, 40 miles northeast of Bennington, it was small and isolated. Only about 300 people lived there, farmers, loggers, and their families, fighting to survive on stubborn land. Winters were always hard in Millbrook. But the winter of 1846-47 was different. It was worse. Much worse. Temperatures fell so low that whiskey froze solid overnight. The Connecticut River was locked under 4 feet of ice. The last supply wagons had made it through in November, and no one expected fresh goods until spring. By February, 5 people were already dead. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger, was found frozen in his cabin after his chimney collapsed. A baby in the Fairchild family died of pneumonia despite the doctor's best efforts. And now the town's food and medicine were running dangerously low. Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, Harvard-trained, now living in Millbrook after a gambling scandal ruined him in Boston, was almost out of laudanum and quinine. His surgical instruments were worn and dull. Every day he wondered how he would save anyone if another fever swept through town. The people were tired, hungry, and scared. Some whispered about leaving Millbrook entirely come spring. Then came February 18th, the night that changed everything. It was during a blizzard so fierce that even the hardiest woodsmen stayed inside. Snowdrifts swallowed fences. Winds bent trees to the ground. Most folks wouldn't open their doors for fear the storm would tear them off their hinges. 14-year-old Timothy Prescott, son of the general store owner, was checking the back windows for ice damage when he saw movement out on the mountain path. At first he thought it was a trick of the snow, a shifting shadow. But then the shape grew clearer. A man. Not staggering, not wandering, but walking. He moved with steady, deliberate steps, as if the screaming wind and blinding snow meant nothing to him. As if he knew exactly where he was going. Timothy called his father. Soon, half the men in town were at the store windows, watching in silence as the stranger approached. He looked wrong. His coat was made from some thick animal hide they didn't recognize. Snow slid off it without melting in. Beneath it he wore layers of strange, tightly woven fabric that gleamed faintly in the lamplight, almost like metal thread. But it was his boots that made the men murmur. They left deep, strange prints in the snow, patterns of studs and spikes in careful shapes, unlike any boot made in New England or Europe. When he finally reached the edge of town, the wind whipping at his cloak, the men could see his face clearly. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and powerful legs. His hair was black streaked with white, though he looked no older than 35. His cheekbones were sharp, his nose strong, his gaze intense. And somehow, though he claimed he had been walking for days in the blizzard, he was not frostbitten. His fingers and toes were whole, his skin flushed with warmth. Dr. Putnam would later write that this was impossible, unless the man had shelter and supplies he did not speak of. The stranger gave his name as Samuel Hawthorne. He said little else at first, only that he had come from far beyond the mountains. He claimed to know medicine. And when, within days, he began saving lives during a sudden outbreak of winter fever, the people of Millbrook started calling him a hero. But the truth was far darker. For while Samuel Hawthorne had indeed come to help the people of Millbrook survive the winter, the way he meant to do it was something no civilized soul could accept. And by the time they learned the truth, it was already far too late. End of Part 1. Samuel Hawthorne. Part 2. The Man Who Never Slept. From the moment Samuel Hawthorne stepped out of that blizzard, the people of Millbrook couldn't stop talking about him. His skin was weathered but healthy, too healthy for someone who claimed to have survived weeks in the wilderness with little food. His face was sharp, his cheekbones high, his nose strong, but it was his eyes that people remembered most. They were pale blue, so pale they almost looked colorless in certain light, like ice over deep water. And when he looked at someone, it wasn't just looking. It felt like he was measuring them, weighing them, deciding something about them they would never know. Children were drawn to him the way kids might be fascinated by a dangerous animal. Adults kept their distance. They couldn't explain why. Hawthorne spoke perfect English, but with an accent no one could place. It wasn't British, though sometimes it sounded close. It wasn't German or Scandinavian, though there were hints of both. Dr. Putnam, who had traveled before settling in Vermont, said it was an accent that borrows from many places but belongs to none. His words were precise, his vocabulary impressive, but now and then he'd use phrases no one had heard before, old words, strange words, the kind that seemed pulled out of another century. When asked where he came from, he told a story that was beautiful and disturbing. He said he came from beyond the great peaks, from valleys where the sun shone differently and the seasons followed older patterns. He spoke of my people, a community that lived in perfect harmony with nature's harshest rules. Not fighting the wilderness, but understanding it, accepting its necessary cruelties. The most unsettling thing about him, though, wasn't his stories. It was the satchel, a large leather bag made from the same strange, weatherproof hide as his coat. It never left his side, not even when he slept. Inside were medicines and tools for survival, though no one had ever seen anything like them. In time, the contents of that satchel would become the source of Millbrook's worst nightmares. But in those first desperate days, the townspeople saw only hope. That very first night, he proved his worth. They were at the Millbrook Inn, warming by the fire, when young Sarah Thornberry started coughing, harsh, ragged coughing that had drive. Putnam worried about consumption. Hawthorne listened, just listened. Then he said the cough came from smoke trapped in poorly ventilated fireplaces, irritating her lungs. From his satchel, he pulled a tiny glass vial filled with a dark liquid that smelled of pine needles, and something else. Something sweet, almost pleasant, but wrong. 3 drops in warm water, he said. Within an hour, Sarah's cough eased. By morning, it was gone. Word spread fast. By the end of the next day, half the town was lined up outside the inn, hoping the stranger could cure them too. Dr. Putnam was skeptical, at first. But Hawthorne's diagnoses were accurate, his treatments, effective. Too effective. Even in the dead of winter, he could find medicinal plants buried under snow. He could identify illnesses at a glance, ones that had puzzled Putnam for weeks. His cures worked with uncanny speed. When Sarah's sickness worsened, Hawthorne prepared a boiling mixture of roots and what he claimed was preserved mountain game meat, using ingredients pulled from his satchel's deep pockets. The smell was strange, sweet and sickly, with a faint undertone that made some townsfolk think of Henrik Bergstrom's cabin, the week they found him frozen and decomposed. When Mrs. Fortesque asked about the recipe, Hawthorne only smiled. "The ways of my people have kept us alive for centuries," he said. Sarah recovered in 3 days. But she told her mother about vivid dreams. Dreams of walking through endless white fields, of dark shapes calling to her in languages she didn't know, promising warmth, and a sacred feast. Grateful for her daughter's recovery, Grace Thornberry insisted Hawthorne stay in their spare room. Her husband Thomas wasn't so sure, but he agreed. Grace soon began noticing habits. He never slept more than 2 or 3 hours, waking often to sit by the window, staring out at the snow with unblinking focus. He vanished for hours during the worst storms, returning with dry clothes, strange plants, and, most puzzling of all, fresh meat. The hunters in town hadn't seen deer or rabbit for weeks. Yet Hawthorne brought back perfect cuts of game, sliced with uncanny precision. But the older hunters noticed something odd. The meat didn't quite look like it came from any animal they knew. And then, one night, Thomas Thornberry followed him. What he saw in the snow was not a hunt. It was something far worse. End of part 2. Got it? Here's part 3 of your story, written to match the tone, pacing, and unsettling detail of the previous sections. Inside the shallow cave, Timothy found rows of neatly wrapped bundles stacked on shelves made from rough-cut branches lashed together with strips of hide. At first, he assumed they were food stores. Perhaps Hawthorne had been hiding extra meat from the townspeople. But as he brushed snow from one of the packages, the wrapping came loose, and something pale and stiff slid into view. It was a hand. The skin was ashen and leathery from the cold, the fingers curled slightly inward, the nails cracked and discolored. Timothy's stomach lurched as he realized the truth: this was no animal meat. Several of the bundles, when disturbed, revealed similar contents: human limbs, torsos, and, in one case, a head with its eyes closed as if in sleep. All had been preserved with an unknown mixture of resinous sap and crystalline powder that kept the flesh from decaying despite the damp cold of the cave. Terrified, Timothy stumbled backward, kicking over a smaller bundle that split open when it hit the ground. From within tumbled several personal items: a child's knitted mitten, a man's pocket watch, a pair of spectacles with one cracked lens. They were belongings that Timothy recognized from people who had gone missing over the past 2 winters. Before he could run, a shadow fell over the cave entrance. Hawthorne stood there, silent, the wind whipping his long coat around his legs. His pale eyes caught the dim light filtering into the cave, and for a moment Timothy felt as though he were staring into a frozen pond, beautiful, deadly, and fathomless. "You've found my pantry," Hawthorne said softly, as if speaking to a wayward child who had opened the wrong cupboard. "It is not yet time for the others to know." Timothy tried to bolt past him, but Hawthorne's hand shot out with inhuman speed, gripping the boy's shoulder so tightly that Timothy gasped in pain. Hawthorne bent down so that his mouth was next to Timothy's ear. "Listen to me, little one. I could silence you now. But I see promise in you. You are clever, curious. That curiosity will be your salvation, if you learn when to keep it hidden." His tone was almost gentle, but there was no mistaking the threat beneath it. When Timothy returned to the village an hour later, shivering and pale, he told his parents he had slipped on ice and hit his head, explaining his dazed state. But he avoided Hawthorne's gaze for days afterward, and Dr. Putnam noticed the boy's sudden reluctance to leave home after dark. Meanwhile, Putnam's investigation grew more desperate. Several of Hawthorne's recent patients were displaying increasingly erratic behavior, fits of rage followed by periods of unnatural lethargy, and in some cases, episodes of wandering the snowy streets at night, barefoot, seemingly unaware of the cold. They spoke in strange, rhythmic murmurs that no one could understand, as if reciting some chant in a forgotten tongue. Putnam began to suspect that Hawthorne's medicines were not merely physical treatments but carried a kind of ritualistic or symbolic significance, a way to bind his patients to him in body and mind. The dreams they reported were becoming more detailed, too. The shadowy figures in the snow now had faces of the missing. The eternal feast they whispered about was described with grotesque clarity. Tables carved from ice, laden with meat that steamed in the frigid air, and guests who smiled with mouths far too wide. The final piece of evidence came on a night in late March, when the thaw had just begun. Putnam, determined to confront Hawthorne with proof of his crimes, followed him during one of his so-called gathering trips. The doctor trailed the stranger through a winding path in the mountains until he reached a narrow gorge. There, illuminated by moonlight, Hawthorne knelt beside what looked like a fresh kill, though the body was unmistakably human. The stranger was working methodically, removing organs with practiced precision and placing them into waxed cloth bundles. He paused once to drink from a small vial, tilting his head back so that the pale light caught his throat as he swallowed. Putnam's heart pounded in his ears, but he could not move, could not tear his gaze from the scene. When Hawthorne finally looked up, his face and hands slick with dark blood, he smiled, not the unsettling, cryptic smile of the village inn, but something far more primal. "You see now, Doctor," he called into the night, his voice carrying across the gorge. "The feast has already begun. If you want, I can carry this forward into Part 4, where Hawthorne's control over Millbrook reaches its breaking point and the townspeople begin to either resist him, or join him." Part 4. By late January, Millbrook was no longer the same town it had been before Samuel Hawthorne's arrival. Snow lay thick on the rooftops, but the true chill came from the strange order that had taken hold. People moved quietly in the streets, glancing over their shoulders, speaking only when necessary. It wasn't fear of violence that kept them hushed, it was something deeper, something that had settled into their bones. Hawthorne rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His instructions were given in low, deliberate tones, and somehow they carried more weight than a shouted command. If he told a man to abandon his business and take up carpentry, that man would do it without question. If he told a woman to stop visiting certain friends, she would comply as though the idea had been her own. Dr. Prescott saw it happening every day, this quiet reshaping of the town's will. "It's not persuasion," he told Reverend Putnam one evening as they walked through the bitter wind toward the church. "It's replacement. He's not convincing them, he's becoming them." Putnam, whose face had grown more gaunt in recent weeks, only nodded. "I've seen such things spoken of in the older texts, accounts from missionaries in the far north, among tribes who believed certain men could steal a soul while leaving the body behind." At the same time, there were undeniable benefits to Hawthorne's rule. Illness had dropped sharply, disputes between neighbors disappeared overnight, food seemed to be stretched farther than it should have, and every household had enough wood for the fire. Even the winter's deadly cold seemed less biting in his presence. But these blessings came with a price that few dared to name aloud. One night, a young farmhand named Matthew Harris came pounding on Prescott's door, pale and shaking. "It's my mother," he gasped. She's not herself. She won't answer to her own name. Just sits there smiling, staring out the window, waiting for him to pass by." Prescott followed him to the farmhouse and found Mrs. Harris seated in a wooden chair, eyes glazed, lips parted in a faint smile. She did not blink as the doctor examined her. When he spoke to her, she murmured something under her breath, so softly that Prescott had to lean close to hear. "He knows what the cold is," she whispered. "He knows how to make it stay away." The doctor left shaken. That same week, Reverend Putnam's Sunday sermon took on a sharper tone. Without naming Hawthorne, he warned his congregation of those who come bearing gifts that bind rather than free. He spoke of the dangers of surrendering the will in exchange for comfort, and of the subtle chains that could be laid upon the soul. Hawthorne was there, seated near the back, watching with an expression of mild amusement. When the sermon ended, he approached Putnam, offering his hand. "A fine message, Reverend. Though I wonder, do you speak from faith, or from fear?" Putnam's jaw tightened. Both. From that day forward, Hawthorne began attending every sermon, sitting in the same place, never taking his eyes off the pulpit. By early February, the last few people who resisted his influence, Prescott, Putnam, and a small handful of others, began meeting in secret in the vestry after nightfall. They spoke in low voices, exchanging what little they had observed. "We need proof," Prescott said. "Something undeniable we can show the others before it's too late." But none of them could agree on what "too late" meant anymore. Outside, the snow fell in thick, silent sheets. Somewhere beyond the church walls, Samuel Hawthorne was moving through the dark streets, visiting homes, speaking softly to those who would listen, preparing the town for something none of them could yet name. If you want, I can make Part 5 take this directly into the turning point where Hawthorne's real nature is revealed and the confrontation begins. That would push the tension to its peak. Part 5, The Circle Narrows. By mid-January, the town of Millbrook felt like a stage with only two kinds of actors left: those who moved at Hawthorne's quiet command, and those who avoided speaking his name aloud. The rest, the hesitant, the skeptical, were vanishing into one camp or the other. Prescott could count on one hand the men who still met him for coffee at the depot without glancing over their shoulders. Even fewer dared to be seen in open disagreement with Hawthorne's ideas. The first sign of true danger came not in words, but in silence. Benjamin Carter, a young man Prescott had known since he was a boy, had stood up in the general store and laughed off Hawthorne's talk of preparing for the long night to come. 2 days later, Carter's home was found abandoned, firewood stacked neatly by the door, a pot of stew gone cold on the hearth. His wife and infant son were gone too. There were no signs of struggle, but neither were their footprints leading away in the snow. Prescott suspected Carter had been persuaded to leave town, though how or by whom he could not prove. Still, the fear in his neighbor's eyes deepened. Hawthorne, meanwhile, appeared more often in the company of a select few, men who had once been quiet churchgoers and farmhands, now moving with a strange assurance. They gathered in the evenings at the old grist mill, lanterns glowing behind its boarded windows. The sound of low chanting sometimes drifted across the frozen river, carrying phrases Prescott could not understand. Putnam, his face drawn and pale from sleepless nights, confided in Prescott one evening. "Greater than, it's not just medicine anymore," he said, leaning close. "I've seen the things they brew in that mill. Tinctures darker than ink, powders that smoke when touched by flame. And they drink them." Prescott felt a slow chill in his bones. "Have you told the sheriff?" Putnam gave a humorless laugh. "Sheriff Matthews. He's been taking Hawthorne's herbal remedies for weeks. Says they keep him sharp." It was then Prescott realized the circle around Hawthorne was tightening, not around him, but around the town itself. Every man of influence, every voice that might stand against him, was being brought under his sway. The final straw came when Reverend Wilkes, once Millbrook's loudest moral authority, delivered a Sunday sermon that sounded more like a warning against dissent than a call to faith. He spoke of obedience to wise leadership and sacrifice for the greater good, his eyes fixed not on the Bible in his hands, but on the back pew where Hawthorne sat smiling faintly. After the service, Prescott turned to Putnam. "Greater than, we're running out of allies," he said quietly. Putnam's jaw clenched. Then we'll have to find strength in the ones we still have. But in his heart, Prescott knew that every passing day brought them closer to a point of no return, a point where the town's fate would be sealed not by open conflict, but by quiet, willing surrender. If you want, I can make Part 6 push straight into the first open act of defiance against Hawthorne, setting up the confrontation. That will also raise the stakes sharply. Part 6: The first signs of the thaw. By the second week of February, Millbrook was reduced to a silent map of narrow footpaths carved through shoulder-high drifts. The river was locked under 2 feet of ice, and the mill wheel, once the town's heartbeat, stood frozen in place like some ancient fossil. Hunger had become a constant companion, as familiar as the bitter wind. And yet, there was an odd sense of vitality in the eyes of those who had been given Hawthorne's tinctures. Old Mrs. Illerby, who had not risen from her bed in months, was now walking the main road with her cane, cheeks flushed like a girl's. Young John Tully, whose lungs had rattled with sickness since autumn, was hauling wood without coughing. To the casual eye, these were miracles. But to Deputy Putnam, they were warnings. He had noticed the changes first in Sarah Price. Though her cough was gone, her eyes had taken on a strange clarity, almost luminous, especially in the dark. Her voice was softer, yet her words carried an odd weight, as if each sentence had been carefully measured. When Putnam mentioned this to Prescott, the older man nodded grimly. "I've seen it before," he said. "In the war, with men who fell under the sway of certain battlefield doctors. The medicine changes more than the body, son. It changes the will." By now, Hawthorne had ceased asking for coin in exchange for his remedies. He gave them freely, asking only for small acts of service, in return, fetching firewood, repairing a fence, delivering notes to his patients. But these errands began to form a quiet network. It became clear that many in town were working, without question, to advance whatever private business he was conducting. Late one night, Putnam caught sight of 3 men, Thomas McGreevy, Caleb Ward, and Henry Evers, slipping out toward the eastern woods carrying burlap sacks. None of them spoke. None of them looked back. The next day, McGreevy swore he had spent the evening at home, though Putnam knew it was a lie. More unsettling still, when asked about the contents of the sacks, McGreevy's face went blank, as though the question itself meant nothing to him. Meanwhile, the blizzard broke for 2 days, revealing a hard, crystalline landscape. Hawthorne used the break to convene what he called a community evening in the meeting hall. Nearly everyone came. Candles burned low in their holders. A fire roared at the hearth. Hawthorne stood before them in his long black coat, his voice low and almost tender. "This winter will test us," he said. "But remember, what we endure together will make us stronger. When the thaw comes, Millbrook will rise renewed. Not all will be ready for that rebirth, but those of you who have shown loyalty, you will be my foundation." It was the way he said "my foundation" that chilled Prescott to the bone. Afterward, while the town drifted home through the snow, Prescott and Putnam lingered in the shadows, watching Hawthorne walk toward the old Baxter barn, an abandoned structure at the edge of town. In his hand was a small wooden box. 2 figures followed him, Sarah Price and Mrs. Illerby. Both looked serene, as though walking in a dream. Prescott's breath fogged in the cold as he whispered to Putnam, "If we don't act soon, it won't just be the sick who belong to him. It'll be the whole damn town." But the deputy noticed something else that night, something that would keep him awake long after the meeting. For the first time in weeks, a faint, almost imperceptible sound carried on the wind from the frozen river, the slow, rhythmic drip of water beneath the ice. The thaw was coming, and whatever Hawthorne had planned, it would happen before spring. If you want, I can now send part 7, where the thaw begins to break the town's isolation and Hawthorne's influence deepens into something openly dangerous. That's when the horror will sharpen. Here's part 7 of The Winter of Hawthorne, following the same style and tone you requested. Part 7 The Fire in the Cellar. The storm that descended upon Millbrook in mid-February was unlike anything the town had seen in living memory. Snow came in waves, burying doorways and smothering chimneys, while the wind keened like a thing alive. By the second night, even the hardiest farmers admitted that to step outside was to risk death within minutes. The settlement became a cluster of pale mounds under a shifting white sky, connected only by the faint flicker of lamplight through frost-covered windows. Hawthorne's home, however, seemed immune to the storm's cruelty. The wind howled, but his roof held. Snow piled high, but his windows glowed warmly at all hours. A faint, steady plume of smoke rose from his chimney, always the same volume, never faltering. To those who were desperate enough to brave the drifts, his door opened swiftly, and the smell of roasting meat drifted into the night air. It was on the third night of the blizzard that John Putnam, unable to bear the mystery any longer, bundled himself in every coat and scarf he owned and made his way to Hawthorne's house. He told himself it was only to check on the man, but his true aim was to learn what fuel kept that fire so strong when half the town's woodpiles were gone. When Hawthorne answered, his expression was warm, almost paternal, though his eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "John," he said, "you'll freeze out there. Come in." Putnam stepped into a heat so thick it made him dizzy. He glanced around and saw that the parlor stove roared at full strength, but what caught his attention was the faint rumbling beneath his feet. Somewhere under the floorboards, another fire burned hotter still. "I've been meaning to ask," Putnam began, forcing a smile. "How do you keep it going? I've seen men burning their furniture to survive this storm." Hawthorne's reply was smooth. "Preparation, my friend. A wise man gathers more than he needs. I have a store below. Perhaps you'd like to see it." Putnam hesitated. Something in Hawthorne's tone felt like a test. Still, he nodded, and Hawthorne led him down a narrow staircase to the cellar. The heat hit him first, an almost suffocating wave, far greater than any fire should produce. Then came the smell, sharp and metallic beneath the scent of burning wood. The cellar was lined with heavy shelves stacked with jars of dark liquid, burlap sacks, and strange bundles wrapped in waxed cloth. But what drew Putnam's eyes, and quickened his heartbeat, was the great iron furnace at the far wall. Its door was ajar, spilling a red glow that danced across the stone floor. Inside, something blackened and curled lay atop the coals. It was shaped wrong for firewood. Too smooth in some places, too jointed in others. Hawthorne stepped in front of him, blocking his view, and closed the furnace door with deliberate slowness. "Some fuels are unconventional," he said softly. "But they burn hotter, longer. And in times like these, survival requires certain adjustments." Putnam's stomach lurched. He thought of the missing dogs, the missing goats, and the 2 trappers who had vanished on the ridge last month. Hawthorne's hand clamped on his shoulder. "You understand, don't you, John? We are the only ones strong enough to do what must be done." Putnam swallowed hard. The heat pressed in on him, along with the weight of those words. He managed a nod, though his mind screamed to run. Upstairs, Hawthorne poured him tea, and they spoke of the storm as if nothing had happened. But when Putnam finally stepped back into the howling night, the wind no longer felt like the greatest danger in Millbrook. If you want, I can send part 8 where the storm begins to break, but suspicion against Hawthorne grows into a dangerous plan to expose him. That's when the real dread sets in. Part 8 The Turning of the Town. The frost came early that year. By the end of October, Millbrook's streets were lined with brittle leaves that skittered along the ground like dry bones. The days were short, the nights long, and the lamps in the windows seemed to glow dimmer than in years past. People said it was the cold making them feel that way. Others whispered that it was Hawthorne. By now, even those who had once praised his gifts were uneasy. Too many strange recoveries had ended in stranger fates. There was Thomas Avery, who had been cured of his fever but now spoke only in riddles no one could understand. Mary Ellen Brooks, who had been saved from wasting away, but now wandered at night barefoot in the frost, humming a tune no one recognized. Hawthorne never explained these changes. He would simply nod gravely and tell the families that healing often came with a cost. Most accepted this, out of gratitude or fear, or perhaps because his pale, unblinking gaze made questioning him feel like trespassing into something dangerous. Reverend Prescott had begun holding his sermons later in the evening, hoping to draw more townsfolk in with the warmth of the chapel. But the pews stayed mostly empty. People claimed they were too tired, or the roads too icy. In truth, many felt a stronger pull toward Hawthorne's small apothecary. Where the air was always warm, the fire smelled of pine, and the man himself welcomed them like an old friend. Dr. Putnam, once so sure of himself, had grown withdrawn. He kept to his office, drinking more than was his habit, his hands shaking whenever the subject of Hawthorne arose. It was as though the man's presence had drained the will to fight from him. One night, just past midnight, Sarah Thorne was roused by a knock on her door. Opening it, she found a girl, no more than 15, standing barefoot in the snow. Her skin was as white as the ground beneath her feet, her lips a strange purplish blue. Sarah recognized her as Betsy Carroll, who had been bedbound with a wasting illness until Hawthorne had given her one of his treatments 2 weeks before. Betsy's eyes were glassy and distant, yet she spoke in a calm, almost rehearsed tone. "He says you should not resist him. He says resistance makes it worse." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Who says that, Betsy?" she asked. The girl smiled faintly, as though sharing a private joke. "You know who. You've always known." Then she turned and walked away, leaving no footprints in the snow. Word of the incident spread quickly among the few who still dared to speak openly. Prescott, Putnam, and Sarah met in the Reverend's study the following night. The wind howled outside as Prescott leaned over the table, voice low and urgent. "This is not medicine, it's influence. Control. And the longer we wait, the more he roots himself here." Putnam stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "If we move against him and fail, the town will turn on us. They already believe him a miracle worker." Sarah's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "Then we need proof. Something no one can deny. Something so clear it breaks whatever hold he has on them." The Reverend nodded slowly. "And to find that proof, we may have to follow him." It was a dangerous thought, and they all knew it. But as the clock in the corner chimed midnight, the three exchanged grim, wordless agreement. Outside, unseen in the shadows of the street, Hawthorne stood watching the glow from the study window. The faintest smile touched his lips before he turned and walked away, the snow swallowing the sound of his footsteps. If you want, I can continue immediately with part 9 so the tension keeps climbing without breaking the mood. The Winter of Hawthorne, Part 9. By late February, Millbrook's bones ached with cold. The snow lay in hardened ridges along the streets, soiled with ash and animal tracks. The river had frozen solid enough for boys to walk across without fear, though their mothers forbade it. Yet the coldest thing in town was not the air, it was the look in Samuel Hawthorne's eyes when he passed those who dared to question him. The weekly gatherings in the old meeting hall had shifted in tone. Once, They were casual affairs with tea and bread, where townsfolk exchanged weather news and shared seed catalogs for the coming spring. Now, they were ritualized events, conducted in near silence. Hawthorne would stand at the head of the room, his hands folded, speaking in short, deliberate phrases about endurance, sacrifice, and the folly of doubt. His words had a strange rhythm, one that seemed to leave some listeners in a trance, as though they had forgotten how to blink. Not everyone attended anymore. Reverend Prescott had stopped going after a tense exchange over the herbal mixtures Hawthorne distributed. He'd warned from the pulpit that blind trust in any man, no matter how charming, was dangerous. Hawthorne never named him in reply, but the townsfolk noticed Prescott's woodpile was mysteriously found scattered one morning, half buried in snow. The Reverend, stubborn as a fence post, stacked it again without comment. Sheriff Putnam, meanwhile, had begun keeping a quiet tally. He noted each family that had become deeply tied to Hawthorne's remedies, and each that had withdrawn from his influence. The list of loyalists was growing far faster than the list of skeptics. Putnam felt the balance tipping towards something the town might not recover from. Then came the matter of the Olmsted girl. Sarah Olmsted had been recovering well from her winter illness, thanks, by all accounts, to Hawthorne's tinctures. But after a fresh vial was delivered to her father's shop, she worsened. Her breathing became shallow, her skin pallid. Prescott was called in, but when he tried to inspect the liquid, the vial had vanished. Mr. Olmsted swore Hawthorne had simply taken it back to improve the mixture. The incident festered in the minds of those already wary. Prescott and Putnam met privately one snowy evening, joined by Mrs. Eliza Merriweather, who ran the boarding house and had observed Hawthorne's comings and goings with the precision of a bookkeeper. They spoke in low voices, the wind rattling the window panes. "He keeps no records," Eliza said. "No purchases from the apothecary, no orders by post. Yet he has ingredients no one else can find this winter." Prescott leaned in. "And every time someone questions him, he turns the town against them. Softly, so it feels like their own thought." Putnam rubbed his jaw. "Then we stop talking about it in whispers. We bring it into daylight." But daylight in Millbrook was thin in February, and Hawthorne seemed to thrive in the shadows between one snowstorm and the next. By the month's final week, he announced that the next gathering would be of a more solemn nature, one meant to seal the community's strength for the trials to come. He invited every family, naming those who had been absent in recent weeks. For those who mistrusted him, it felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. The night before the meeting, a blizzard rolled in, hammering Millbrook with a wall of white. But Hawthorne's announcement had carried a strange weight, enough that many residents, wrapped in layers of wool and desperation, would brave even the harshest cold to attend. As the snow deepened outside and the lamps burned low in their homes, a quiet, pressing fear took hold in the hearts of the few who still resisted. They sensed that whatever Hawthorne had planned for this gathering would mark the point of no return. And the blizzard, rather than deterring it, might serve to lock them all inside with him. If you want, I can send Part 10 next as the final, intense confrontation and conclusion of the Winter of Hawthorne. The Winter of Hawthorne, Part 10, Final Part. The storm broke 3 nights later. Snow came down in thick sheets, muffling every sound except the shriek of the wind. The boarding house shuddered under the weight of the drifts piling against its walls. Inside, the few remaining townsfolk huddled in the dim light of oil lamps, faces pale, eyes hollow from weeks of rationing. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed clothes, boiled potatoes, and fear. Samuel Hawthorne moved among them like a priest at some unholy altar, his shadow stretching across the warped floorboards. He carried no lantern, he did not need one. His presence seemed to draw the eyes of everyone in the room without effort. "Tomorrow," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the howl outside, "we will begin anew. The weekdays are over. The doubters have left us or been cast aside. Those who remain will endure." No one spoke. In the far corner, Drive, Prescott's hand tightened around the heavy oak cane in his lap. Beside him, Putnam shifted his weight, the old musket hidden beneath a wool blanket. They had not told anyone their plan, not even each other in plain words, but both men understood the moment had come. Hawthorne crossed to the fireplace, where the embers glowed low. He produced the little vial again, the one that had started it all, and held it in the flickering light. 3 drops, as before. And then the fever will not touch you. The hunger will not weaken you. You will belong to winter, as I do. Prescott rose. The scrape of his chair legs against the floor broke the silence. "No more, Hawthorne," he said, his voice steady. "Your cures are poison. Your promises are chains." For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Hawthorne's smile faltered. "You think you can stop me, Doctor? You think your brittle body and your dull steel are enough?" His tone was calm, almost pitying. "I am older than this storm. I have seen winters that buried whole valleys. I have outlived men better than you." Putnam stood then, throwing the blanket aside, the musket aimed squarely at Hawthorne's chest. The room tensed like a drawn bowstring. "Maybe so," Putnam said, "but you won't outlive this night." Hawthorne's eyes gleamed, not with fear, but with something darker, almost delighted. "Do it, then. See if the winter cares for your little victory." The shot cracked through the boarding house, deafening in the enclosed space. Hawthorne staggered back, crimson blooming across his coat, but he did not fall. His breathing deepened, his shoulders straightened, and the blood slowed, then stopped, the wound knitting before their eyes. A gasp rippled through the room. "You see," Hawthorne said, voice low and terrible. "The cold preserves. The old ways preserve." Prescott didn't wait. He surged forward, driving the iron tip of his cane straight into Hawthorne's chest, just above the heart. There was a sound, not quite a scream, not quite the wind, as the man's eyes went wide. The fire flared violently in the hearth, casting the room in a brief, blinding light. When it dimmed, Hawthorne was on the floor, the vial shattered beside him, the dark liquid seeping into the boards. Outside, the wind began to die. By dawn, the storm had passed. The townsfolk emerged to find the snow piled high but the air strangely still, almost gentle. Hawthorne's body was gone, leaving only the iron-tipped cane and a black stain where he had fallen. Spring came late to Millbrook that year. The ice on the river didn't break until May, and the scars on the town lingered far longer. But Prescott and Putnam never spoke of what truly happened that night. Some truths, they decided, were better left buried in the snow. Still, when the first frost came the following autumn, a few swore they saw a tall figure watching from the tree line, a dark coat, a pale face, and eyes the color of winter. And the wind carried a whisper. "The cold preserves." If you enjoyed this chilling tale of Samuel Hawthorne and want more spine-tingling historical horror stories, don't forget to like this video to support the channel. Subscribe so you never miss the next dark journey into forgotten corners of history. Share this story with friends who love a good shiver down their spine. And leave a comment below, what part of Samuel Hawthorne's winter haunted you the most? Your thoughts keep our stories alive, and the darkness listening.